Double tap to flip camera.
Daled, we start today.
Okay, we are online. We're starting Daled. Daled, interesting, you'll notice in the Hebrew that over here, are we recording? We're recording. Okay, Daled, you'll notice, if you look in the Hebrew, halfway through the chapter, it splits in half. Right? You see that? That's because we have in Daled, in chapter 4, we have what's called Madura Kama and Madura Basra. Madura means version, and Kama and Basra means first and last. So in other words, Tzemach Tzedek wrote two versions of the Maimer. And rather than choosing one, they printed both. I don't know if that was on the Tzemach Tzedek, if that was the Tzemach Tzedek's decision that both should be printed, both should be included. I'm not sure, but the Tzemach Tzedek wrote two versions. We're going to start with the Madura Kama, and in future weeks, I'm going to decide whether it's worth doing the Madura Basra, or we're just going to do the Madura Kama and then move on, whether it's worth doing the later version. The later version is more complicated. The later version is a little more esoteric. The earlier version is shorter and I think more straightforward. So we'll start with the earlier version. And I may decide that we should go back and do the later version as well, which just means that we'll have very good review on this chapter, because it's generally speaking the same ideas, but they're expressed in a different way, in a way that's a little more esoteric and more difficult. Okay, we are beginning chapter 4. At the end of chapter 3, we're on a cliffhanger of sorts. The end of chapter 3 found us with a machlokes, with a disagreement between the Maharal and the Rambam, if you'll recall. Right, the Rambam, Maimonides, speaking from the perspective of philosophy, speaking from the perspective of what a person can learn about God from the rules of logic and from looking at the world around him, the Rambam concluded that what is God? God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, which, if you'll recall, is not a statement of affirmatively of what God is, but is rather a statement of the manner in which God is unknown to us. It says his unknown manifestation must unite these forms of knowledge, right? Because if he knows as a human knows, that means he has a knowledge that's outside of himself. That's a whole problem for unity, the unity of God, the oneness of God, right? So the Rambam says he knows in a way that only he knows. He knows the reality. He knows the world through knowing himself. And he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. He is all these three things united. The Maharal's problem with the Rambam, if you'll recall, is that you're still calling God knowledge, right? The Maharal says that that's too low of a conception of God. God himself is totally undefined, is completely simple, and his knowledge is something that he does outside of himself. He lowers himself down to know. He himself is not knowledge. Yeah, Spencer, a quick question?
The known.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
The object of the knowledge. The knower is the one who knows. The known is the object, and the knowledge is the faculty that connects them. Right? Okay. So that's why we say it's knowing himself, right? Because he's the known. He's what through knowing himself he knows everything. However that works. The Rambam says that process is not really graspable by the human mind. So what came out from all of that was basically that each one of them had a worldview that makes a sacrifice, right? The Rambam sacrifices God's simplicity. He sacrifices God being completely indescribable and says that God actually is the one who knows. God is actually knowing. What he sacrifices in simplicity, by saying that God is completely an abstraction and completely above even knowing, what he sacrifices in simplicity, he gains in God's closeness or God's relationship with the world, right? At the end of the day, it is God who knows. Right? God himself knows. Although he may not be as abstract or as removed a God as the Maharal would prefer, nevertheless, at least it is he himself who knows. Right? The Maharal has exactly the opposite take. The Maharal says that the ultimate is God's simplicity. We cannot sacrifice God's simplicity. He is not to say that he himself knows is like sacrilege. God is absolutely above and beyond knowing or relating. He himself does not relate to the world in any way. That would be in contradiction to simplicity. That would be a limitation on God. right? But on the other hand, what he loses is that now when he says God knows something, he has to mean that he lowers himself down to know. The knowing is not what God naturally does, right? The knowledge is to some extent or in some way outside of or below God himself. So you have a higher God at the cost of a removal of God further away from the world, so to speak. The knowledge of the world, according to the Maharal, is in some way outside of God, right? So we understand the costs and benefits, right? So it's like an economics thing, right? There's no solutions. There's only cost versus benefits, right? Something like that. So each of them has its cost and has its benefit. Now the Tzemach Tzedek is going to analyze this, and basically, right? We finished the chapter by explaining, by clarifying and restating that that according to the Tzemach Tzedek, what the Rambam says is true, that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. And this lower form of God, this form of God, as he lowers himself down to be known within the world, really not known within the world, right? But the language can get confusing. He lowers himself down to be known in the world. That's true in the spiritual world of Atzilus. That, in other words, God creates a reality in which the Rambam's God is true. He is the God of that reality. However, that reality is itself a creation. That's not God himself. That is something God has created. God creates a reality in which, if you look at that reality and you come to your conclusion about God, the conclusion you'll come to is the God of the Rambam, the knower, the knowledge, and the known. The God of the Maharal, we said, it all worked out very neatly, the God of the Maharal, who is totally above knowing, and in fact to whom knowledge and the creation of actual physical objects is at the same level of remove, his knowledge is completely separate from him, just like creating the physical world. That God is the God of above nature, above what he invests in the world. That is the God of Emunah. That's the God of faith. And therefore, we came to we saw how the Rambam's conception is the highest form of the God of knowledge, and beyond that, the Maharal's conception is the God of faith, is the God that can't be known in that way from the world, but rather is the God of faith, the God as he does not invest himself within the world. Okay, that's where we are now. As we're going to see, there's all sorts of hidden problems in these worldviews, which the Tzemach Tzedek is going to bring up. We're going to see what's wrong, I think, if I'm not mistaken, with the Maharal's worldview, with the Maharal's conception of God, because to say it the way the Maharal says it means that when God knows something, we have all sorts of problems now. And in solving that problem, we're going to explain how Chassidus can have it both ways, how you can have a God that is removed, who he himself does not know, and yet he knows the world and is completely united with that knowing. In other words, now we begin, and I didn't tell you this from the beginning because it probably would have been too much, but now chapter 4 is where we begin the slow process of demonstrating that knowledge and faith are not as demarcated and separate from one another as we may have indicated so far. There's a certain unity, there's a certain interplay between knowledge and faith, and that unity, as we're going to see, is quite extensive. And that's what we're going to begin. It's a long discussion. We're going to begin discussing that in this chapter. Okay, chapter 4. I'm on page 85 in the English. Dalet, chapter 4. Lefi zeh tzarich lahavin be'inyan ha'te'arim shebo bo yisbarich b'Torah. According to the above, we must understand the descriptions that God has given in the Torah, right? If you recall, these descriptions have already come up, right? We said when we were talking about the 13 principles of faith, and we said that God is simple and God is one, right? We already said that, but the Torah says that God has a hand, God is loving, God is wise, right? All these different things. And how this seems to be in contradiction with God's oneness. And it is, in fact, dealing with this contradiction that we come to the two conceptions of the Rambam and the Maharal. Right? It's dealing with this problem of what does it mean that God is knowing, that we came to the two solutions. The Rambam's, which was to say God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. He knows in an unknown way. And the Maharal's, which his answer hasn't really been fully fleshed out yet, but the Maharal said basically that God is totally removed from knowing, that knowing is totally beneath him. These are the two different perspectives to answer that issue of what does it mean that God knows something, as it's described in the Torah. The kinulei chazal gamken, and the sages also, in addition to scripture, the sages also gave him titles. Kinui in modern Hebrew is like a nickname. Kagain, chacham v'chasid chulu. For example, the sages call him wise or kind, generous. Let's do footnote 1. That is, as explained in section 3, Rambam had offered a resolution of the question of how the Torah's identification of God with particular attributes is not a contradiction to the principle of his oneness, right? How can he be both one and completely simple and know something, right? The Rambam answered that question. This is a good recap. The Maharal refuted the Rambam's resolution, stating that God is a simple transcendent entity. Seemingly it would follow that he could not be described as wise, right? We're now back to the problem with the Maharal, right? You follow the order here. Right? We have a principle of faith. Roughly everyone in Judaism believes this. It's not as simple as all that. But roughly everyone is on the same page, that God is simple. Yeah, God doesn't have any parts. So what does it mean when the Talmud or the Chumash says God is knowing or God is wise? That means he has a part that's wise, or he has a part that's loving, or there's him and then there's his knowledge, right? There's different levels, but the point is that it seems to contradict his simplicity. The Rambam answered. He said, God, as he is beyond our understanding, does not know the way that we know, with a knowledge outside of us. Rather, he's completely united with his knowledge in every way. That's why it's not a contradiction, because God really is simple. There's only God, and by Godding, right, simply by being himself, he has all of the attributes that are described to him in the Talmud. He is knowing, and he's kind, right, and all of these different things. The Maharal says to the Rambam, you can't play word games like you're just playing word games. Knowing is knowing. There is no other way of knowing. If you know with a knowledge outside of you. Knowing is a contradiction to God's oneness. So the Maharal says, so God is beyond knowing, right? The Maharal comes to the conclusion, knowing is something that if God did would contradict his oneness. God is above knowing, right? Which solves the problem philosophically. Who says God has to know anything? Unfortunately, the answer to the question is, the Talmud says God knows things, right? The Chumash says God knows things. So in other words, the Maharal, by removing the Rambam's answer, is now attacked by the same question that the Rambam was attempting to answer. If the Rambam's answer is no longer sufficient, if we don't say that he knows in a mysterious way that allows him to be one while still knowing, the Maharal says that knowing is always in contradiction to oneness. So then what does it mean when the Talmud says he knows, right? That becomes the question. So if God is totally removed from knowing and the Talmud says he knows, how are we going to square this contradiction? Yeah, clear?
Not just that. Whoever it says something is an abomination or something.
Right, sure. Caring, right, knowing, that's caring, that's the next level, and that's also, by the way, a fascinating discussion in Judaism about which there are many opinions. About that's called hashgacha. That's the extent to which God cares what he knows, right? Knowing is the first step. The first question is, does he know? Once you say he knows, then the question becomes, does he care? And that's also you'd be amazed at how involved that question gets in all the sources. The Rebbe actually wrote a very famous reshima, a very famous note once, like an essay sort of, before he became the Rebbe, categorizing all the different opinions on hashgacha throughout Jewish thought, all the different extents, all the different positions everyone holds on the extent to which God cares about what happens in the world. And Chassidus and the Baal Shem Tov is by far the most extreme, which is funny because most people assume nowadays when you say hashgacha, what does God care about? They give the Chassidic answer. It's interesting. It's an idea from Chassidus that has filtered into the common Jewish consciousness, right? If you ask any Jew, what does God care about in the world? They'll tell you he knows and cares about everything that happens in the world, right? That is a revolutionary idea from the Baal Shem Tov. Before the Baal Shem Tov, no one said that. When we say in the Hayom Yom, right, that the Baal Shem Tov said that God cares when the wind blows the leaf this way instead of this way, right? That is a revolutionary idea of Chassidus in Judaism. That is an unbelievably different opinion than is held. In fact, the much more common than that was the opinion that God only cares about human beings, and he only cares about righteous human beings. And everything else that exists is only a means to an end of providing a world for righteous tzaddikim. God doesn't really care personally about anything else other than that. Right? That is a much more common opinion in Judaism. The Baal Shem Tov revolutionized this idea, revolutionized that area. So that's about God caring. Okay. But before we get to caring, we have to figure out knowing. So the question is, if you hold like the Maharal that God is simple and God is completely removed from knowing, so how is it that he actually knows then? How can the Gemara say, how can the Talmud say, or the Chumash say that God is wise, God is knowing? To answer this, the Gaon, the genius, referring to the Maharal, Oidsham, explains further. In other words, the Maharal, in his own words, answers this question. This is what he says. From this itself that he is simple, ad kamoshe yisboyer, as was explained. In other words, the whole explanation that we read in the previous chapter about how he's simple and he can't be knowledge because knowledge is knowing something outside of yourself, right? Basically saying that the Baal Shem Tov's form of knowledge that he ascribes to God is not something that exists, right? Knowledge is always knowledge outside of yourself, right? And God is simple and God is beyond all that. Given all of that, im lo yahya bishvil sheyugdar b'davar meyuchad. I'm going to read the translation. We are compelled to say that he can also express himself through wisdom or creation. For if he would not know everything, or there would be an entity that does not come into existence from him, that would limit him in a specific way, right? It's not just because the Chumash and the Talmud say so, although that's also important and in some ways more important, but you also have a massive philosophical problem if there's something that came into existence without him, or that he didn't know, or if he didn't know everything, right? As explained in footnote 2, for this entity would be beyond him. The Tzemach Tzedek telescoped the statements of Maharal and we returned them to the original. Hence, the translation does not fit the words entirely. Okay, no wonder I was having trouble explaining it. Okay, so okay, it's a weird print. The translation is strange. So what we're saying is that if he didn't know something, or something didn't depend on him to exist, right, that itself would be a limitation on God, obviously, right? The whole definition of God, before we start all of this, the whole definition of God is that he is what needs nothing and everything else depends on him, right? Obviously, you say there's something out there that God doesn't know, that doesn't depend on God, you're making him not God all of a sudden. Where did that thing come from, right? Well, what gives that thing existence? Everything comes from God. Everything needs God to exist. How could you say there's something that God doesn't know, or that doesn't depend on God to be created? Surely that is not true, that there's anything he doesn't know, because he's not yugdar, God is not limited, right? In fact, the Maharal explained in the previous chapter, if you'll remember from previous weeks, that it is because he is so simple that he knows everything, right? Because nothing is in contradiction to him, whatever that means, right? That's what the Maharal said previously. I guess footnote 3, I guess we're doing all the footnotes. Let's do footnote 3. That is, are you guys with me? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Just as it cannot be said that he is defined as being a particular quality, for that would limit him, so too saying he does not possess a particular quality would also put a limit on him, right? Just as saying he is not wise, just as saying he is wise to the Maharal is a limitation, saying he is not wise is obviously also a limitation. He lacks in wisdom, right? Thus, he cannot be defined by any positive definition, nor can he be defined by any negative definition. You can't say what he is, and you can't even say what he isn't, right? Hence, we are forced to say he includes everything. Therefore, we have to say that he is all-inclusive. There's nothing in contradiction to him. He knows everything. He creates everything, right? This sort of arrangement. Otherwise, he wouldn't be God. This is clear. So it's clear that there's nothing that exists outside of his knowledge. The Maharal says, he knows everything with his wisdom, and he affects everything with his power. He creates, I guess is a better term. He creates everything with his power. And there's no difference between the understanding with which he comprehends everything that exists, or that he does any other activities, right? We're setting up a whole new, so to speak, mechanics, or I guess you'd say metaphysics, right? We're setting up a whole new system. God, this is according to the Maharal. According to the Maharal, God is completely simple. He cannot be described as anything. He can't be described as not anything. There is no description of God. God is completely simple. Somehow, this is the part we haven't explained, God still knows everything with his wisdom, and he affects everything with his power. And his knowing things is no different than the way he affects things. In other words, in the Rambam's view, there's a difference between God knowing things and, say, the creation of the physical world. In the Rambam's view, because God is a being of wisdom himself, so to speak, even though it's a very abstract form of wisdom and knowledge, his knowledge is closer to him than the creation of the physical world. Wisdom is a godly realm, according to the Rambam. As opposed to, say, making tables, right, or giving existence to coffee cups, that is not a godly realm. That is something which is much lower than wisdom. That's something that's much that's removed from God. According to the Maharal, everything is removed from God, and everything is equally removed from God, right? Because the Rambam at least says that God is a being of wisdom. The Maharal says God is a being with no definition whatsoever, right? It's completely abstract. So therefore, in the Maharal's conception, the creation of a coffee cup and God knowing everything, however God may know, are at the same level. They're at the same distance from God. God has to descend from himself. He has to leave being God, or whatever that means. He is affecting something outside of himself, both by knowing a thing and by creating it physically. It's at the same level. It's at the same level for God in the Maharal's conception. Yeah? We understand the difference between the Rambam and the Maharal. The Rambam says knowledge is at a higher level because God is essentially a being of knowledge. The Maharal says God is not a being of knowledge. He's not a being of anything. He's just God. Everything for him is a descent. Is equally, everything he does, including knowing things, is equally far away from who he is.
Whether it be intellect as opposed to, say,
emotion, action, what anything you may ascribe to him, it's all the same. That's exactly the point. That's what we said last time. That what does it say? Kulam b'chachma asisa, right? That everything from Chachma is created. In other words, it's equating by God. He equates the doing. Asisa means physical doing, like manipulation, like with your hand. With His wisdom. That for God, it's all at the same. It's all at the same level.
It's not a level.
It's all. Everything that's not God is equally removed from God. Right? In other words, right? The Rambam is not simple. It's not like that at all. In the Rambam, there's gradations, right? Because in the Rambam, if you say God is a being of wisdom, even if it's a wisdom that we don't understand, right, which is what he says that we can't know that wisdom, we can't know what God is, it's completely beyond us. Nevertheless, by his definition, God is ultimately within the system. There's degrees of closeness to God, right? It's interesting. There's a certain way of maybe this is getting more complicated, but
I was just going to say, it seems like the little Chassidus that I know, it seems it incorporates both concepts fully.
Right. I don't think they're too far away from each other. I think he's looking from up down and he's looking from down up. The Rambam is looking for down up, and he said this is the most we can grasp. Therefore, we'll define it according to wisdom because this is the highest. The intellectual thing is the highest realm we can get. And the Maharal looks from up down, and he said, nothing is God.
So there's two problems with saying it like that. The first problem with saying it like that is that our conclusion is going to be they're talking about two different things.
No, it's two different perspectives.
No, our conclusion is going to be they're actually talking about two different things.
Okay.
That's the first problem.
Okay.
The second problem is that we are at the level in things where we're not just describing things in the world, we're describing the wisdom itself. We're describing the wisdom itself. You can't get around that. The Rambam is saying the wisdom itself is God, is one with God. And the Maharal is emphatically saying the opposite. The Maharal is emphatically saying the wisdom is not one with God. In other words, within the world, maybe you could say the Rambam is looking bottom up and the Maharal is looking bottom down. If we're trying to describe, if we're trying to describe a tree, so the Rambam would say that the tree is made with a certain wisdom, and the form of the tree is what comes from God, or whatever, however you want to say it, and that sort of thing. And the Maharal would say about the tree that the actual the physical making of the tree and God's knowing of the tree are at an equal distance from him. We could say it's all sort of the same. But if we're talking about God's Chachma itself, then we have a major problem, right? If you're talking about the Chachma itself, then there's got to be a difference. The Maharal is saying that the Chachma has nothing to do with God, really, essentially, right? It has as much as trees have to do with God. God's own Chachma, God's knowledge of the tree has to do with God.
Yeah, but then in order...
The Rambam is saying that the knowledge of the tree is God. In fact, there's no separating the two. God Himself is God's knowledge of the tree, right? Whatever that means.
But then, in order for God to be in some way manifest in ways that we understand,
Yeah.
God has to descend.
Yeah.
Okay? And that by itself leads to the practice of deities. Because people would be looking for things
Sure.
that are some way manifestations of God here.
Sure. Absolutely. There's no question.
That's
That's the problem. That's the problem. The problem is that you can mistake the manifestation for God. And in fact, according to Chassidus, many times in history, certain idol worships and things like that were exactly that. Right? We say that the golden calf, I think it says in the Medrash maybe even, or something like that, maybe the Zohar, I can't remember, but it says that the reason why the golden calf was a calf, or why a calf, if they want to worship an idol, it could be anything. Why did they choose a calf? Because they saw there was a revelation of the heavenly chariot at the giving of the Torah, and they saw the Pnei Ashor Shebe Merkava, that on God's chariot, we know, one of the faces, if you read the very mysterious passage on God's chariot in Ezekiel, right, it says one of the faces on God's chariot is the face of a bull. And because they saw the face of a bull on God's chariot, so they thought that this represents God. They mistook the symbol for, right, this is ultimately in some sense, that's what all idolatry is, right? All idolatry is mistaking some manifestation or some great thing that God does for God Himself, right?
But my point is that the Rambam's approach precludes that type of deification. Because knowledge is not something... Yes, you're right. And not just because, in some sense you're wrong. In some sense you're wrong because the deification of knowledge itself, you could argue, is something that did happen as an influence of philosophy. But that's maybe something for a different time. That's not really idol worship in the regular sense that we think of it. But you're right. The Maharal's approach, which is really going to turn out, is in some sense a more Kabbalistic approach, is more prone to that problem, and that is in fact one of the reasons why the study of Kabbalah was not always a popular prospect, right? It's only for people that are well versed in Torah and all these things, right? There's a reason for that, but that's a whole other. We're not there yet where we can even understand what that distinction is necessarily in this mimer. We're speaking relatively basic. We're saying God has to know everything. His knowledge of the thing and the thing itself, right, are both equally distant from Him. His knowledge of the actual physical object and the physical object itself, like God's knowing it, right? When we think of the cup, I understand how the cup is separate from me. When I think of my knowledge of the cup, I don't think of that as something as separate from me as the cup, right? It seems almost very counterintuitive, right? My knowledge of this cup is as distant from me as the actual physical cup is. It's a very counterintuitive concept, right? That's what the Maharal is saying. The Maharal is saying that God's knowledge and the actual thing itself, the object of God's knowledge, are equally distant from God. Ki hasaga gamken pel, because understanding is itself an action. It's also an action. It's not being. You can't. That's the whole disagreement, right? The Rambam says God can be understanding, even though he says he doesn't understand how that's possible. He says that God can be understanding. The Maharal says you can't be understanding. Understanding is something you do, just like woodworking or shoe repair, right? Understanding is not something you be. Understanding is something you do for God, at least, right? It's even brought as a verb when it says, and God knows, right? In other words, God is the noun. God, when people say God is a verb, right? It's an interesting intersection with I don't even know what you'd call it. I guess you'd say pop religious writing, self-help, pseudo-religious self-help. I don't even know. When you say God is a verb, yeah, the Maharal tends to disagree. The Maharal says that God is not a verb. God is the noun. It says V'yada Elokim, which means and God knew. Right? It's a linguistic point. And God, the unknown, the noun. God is something that just is. Right? It's not and God is knowledge. It's not said in a way that God is the knowledge. There's God, the noun, totally separate from what he does, right? What you do doesn't define your essence, right? There's God. And then there's what he does, V'yada Elokim, God knew. Right? That's the point. The point is that the very lashon itself, the very terminology that says and God knew implies that there's God. And then there's his knowing. That's the Maharal's argument. That God is not bound up by any particular attribute. How did I... Right, okay. Yep. Okay, I'm on page 87. Just as it said, and God spoke. Right? In other words, and the language is the exact same as when you say V'yidaber Elokim. In other words, God spoke, God did, God whatever. When the difference between God spoke and God knew, right, and God did, it's all said in the exact same way in the Chumash. There's no distinction. And God said is the exact same grammatical form as and God knew. In other words, they're all equally distant from him. They all equally have the status of a verb. It's not God himself. It's just something that you do.
What about existing?
That's a very good question. I think the answer is going to have to be also. There's even the Rambam says you can't really say that God exists. If the Rambam were to say that God exists, he would say it in a way that he is the exister, the existence, and the existifying all at the same time, or something like that, right? Whatever. Even the Rambam says that, right, the isifying, I think Tzvi Friedman likes to write on Chabad.org. He says things are isified. That's how he translates the Hebrew term hishavus. He says the isification, isifying, right? Because that's what the correct grammatical translation, right? So you're isifying the thing. So God exists. Even the Rambam says you can't say God exists, at least by any definition of exist that applies to anything else. Right? The same way that you can't say God knows by any definition of knowing that applies to anything else, right? The same idea. The Maharal's even beyond. The Maharal says, not only can you not say about God himself that he exists like anything else exists, but when you say that he exists, his existence is as separate from him as his making of physical reality. It's a very good point, Ronnie. I think that's right. I think that's what the Maharal would say. The Maharal would say that his existence is also something that's separate from him. Whatever his existence is exactly. Okay. V'kasher nemar she'en ha'yedia atzmusay. Once you say that knowledge is not his essence, shuv lo yiksha lecha klal, you will not have any further difficulty at all. There's no problem that his knowledge changes, right? Maharal is actually shifting to a different question. The Maharal say, right, we still haven't answered the question, how is it that God, who is totally removed from knowing and whose knowledge is like to him a physical action, how is it that you could actually say then that God knows anything, right? If his knowledge is not one with him in any way. Right? What does that even mean? What does it mean? What does it mean for an absolutely simple God to know of a world? What does it mean that God know? What does it mean when the Chumash says God knows? The Maharal is not yet explained, but he's saying that my answer solves a different question. The answer that the knowledge is completely separate from God explains the changes in knowledge, which is also a very good question, right? When the Rambam says God knows by knowing himself, right? We have to somehow his knowing himself and God himself being completely unchanging has to be a knowledge of a world that is limited and temporal, that changes over time, right? In other words, the Rambam says that knower, the knowledge, and the known, somehow God, by knowing himself, and God is an unchanging unity, right, knows everything that did happen, is happening, and will happen, and knows them in their time, so to speak. He knows when something changes. He knows that the cup is here, and he knows that the cup has then moved to here, right? Which seems, it's very, very hard to begin to understand, how that works. That seems to be saying, if without the Rambam's explanation that God that it just happens, right? That God just knows this somehow by knowing Himself, right? It would seem to be saying that if I move the cup, I have now changed God, right? I've made a change in God, because God knows that the cup is here, and now He knows that the cup is here. His knowledge has changed, right? This is another problem of God's knowledge. Another problem of God's knowledge is, how can God be unchanging and know a changing world, a world where things are moving, where there's motion, where there's differences in things, right?
Now, is that knowledge, or is that a different property?
It doesn't really matter. I think it doesn't really matter what we call it. The point is that if God is aware of this.
Making the cup, or where the cup is.
Sure. Making is an even better question then. How does God, if God is one and totally simple and never moves and never changes, how does He create a world that clearly is not any of those things? That's also a good question.
That proves that He's learning new stuff, making new stuff all the time.
Huh?
It means it's evolving all the time. It's making new stuff.
Right. The question is though, God cannot evolve by definition, right? God doesn't exist within time.
His surroundings is evolving, so He's doing stuff.
But how is the question? That's the question. Is how is that possible? How is it possible, right? Yeah. So that is basically the Rambam's escape, right? It's an escape. It's running away from the question. The question is a very good question on the Rambam's conception of the universe, because God is one with His knowledge. And the answer is that this cannot be understood by the human mind. Or in other words, it was the same idea, right? If I knew Him, I would be Him, right? That's the philosophical answer, right? The Maharal actually has a better answer. According to the Maharal system, the Maharal has his own problem, which we haven't explained yet. The Maharal has his own problem of how can you say in the Chumash that God actually knows something, right? The Rambam has that covered. The Rambam says God is a being of knowledge. He knows everything by knowing Himself, right? It's not a knowledge we understand, but He knows everything by knowing Himself. The Maharal hasn't explained yet at all how God can know anything. He's totally separate. He's totally removed. He's totally simple. What does it even mean for God to know if you say He's totally removed from knowledge, right? So that's the Maharal's problem. But where the Maharal doesn't have a problem is with this whole temporal thing, with knowing a world that's constantly changing, a world that's limited, right? Because if the knowledge is separate from God, what's the problem? Right? If His knowledge is completely separate from Him, then nothing that changes in the world impacts his simplicity, right? God, the Maharal's solution saves God from being ruined by a non-godly world, by a world that exists in time and place, with limitations and with things that with changes, right, with death and rebirth and life and all of these things. The Maharal's understanding rescues God from all of that. God is above everything that happens. However, He knows, His knowledge is separate from Him. Whatever happens to His knowledge doesn't happen to Him. In the Rambam's understanding, whatever happens to God's knowledge happens in God, and somehow that works.
Right. So in that case, the Maharal, how does he come to terms with creation?
That's the question.
That's a good question.
Exactly.
It's the same thing, right?
It is the same thing.
Tablets.
What about the tablets?
When God gave the tablets,
Yeah.
people looked at it, and you could look at it from either side. You could read
Right, it was carved through both ways.
Now, how did that happen?
So you're saying it's a contradiction, right?
Yeah, basically you're asking, how can yes and no exist in the same plane?
The question is not how can God do it, right? Because we start with the assumption that God can do anything. Right. The question is more, at least at this juncture, the question is more, how could the Maharal be, with the inherent problems in his position, choose his position over the Rambam's position, right? Let's look at it like that. We're not, God himself in the actual reality, at least at the moment, without the Tzemach Tzedek's help, is completely beyond our pay grade, right? That's not the question right now. The question is, the Maharal and the Rambam clearly each have issues with they each have things to explain. They each lay out what their position is on God's knowledge, and then you have questions that you ask, right? So there's questions on the Rambam and the questions on the Maharal. And obviously each one sees that their way is the path of least resistance, right? The questions are answered best in this position. Let's assume for a moment, because this is also probably not true, and this adds a bit of a wrinkle to this way of learning the Maimer, but let's assume they both had equal knowledge of everything, right? They had equal knowledge. They had equal knowledge of everything, right? If you want to say that the Rambam was forced to work only from within a philosophical perspective, so that's one answer to why the Rambam is forced to choose his position, right? Although you could still ask, why doesn't the Maharal choose a philosophical position? What's his issue with that, right? Whatever. So the Maharal has a problem with his position, and what we're trying to figure out is, how does he deal with this problem? What makes his position coherent that it could even compare to the Rambam's position, right? So the Maharal is saying, well, there's at least one problem that I don't have that the Rambam has, and that's the problem of knowledge in the world changing, knowledge of a temporal world. According to the Rambam, somehow God knows everything by knowing himself, even though knowing everything means knowing limitation, right? I mean, the limitation somehow, the Rambam cannot explain to you how the limitation of the world doesn't affect God. He just has to say it's the knower of the knowledge and the known all at once. It's like a black box. There's no answer. There's nothing inside, right? It's like magic. God knows in a way that we cannot understand. That way of knowing, by knowing himself, whatever that means, which the Rambam readily admits we cannot understand, that allows him to know a limited, changing world. And that doesn't affect God's unity at all, according to the Rambam, right? And we can't understand why it doesn't. God is beyond us. That's it. The Maharal has other issues, but the Maharal can at least say that the limited and changing and temporal world, however it works, that it has any connection to God whatsoever, which is the problem, right? But at least if God is not bound, if God is not intellect, and God is not limited in any sense, then his knowledge of a changing world, or anything else that happens in the changing world for that matter, does not affect him. He remains unmoving, so to speak. He remains consistent, infinite, simple, and completely unchanged, right? And you don't have to explain it in a way that and it just works, right? You can explain it because his knowledge is separate. Like the Rambam's explanation for that is we can't understand how that works. The Maharal's explanation is slightly better. The Maharal says we cannot understand God himself. God is totally beyond any definition whatsoever. However, his knowledge is separate from him, so we can understand how his knowledge of a changing world doesn't affect him, because his knowledge is... Yeah, that's the question, right? That's the question. In other words, the Maharal is saying, by the way, I solved the problem of how, if his knowledge... Well, he's solving a sub-problem of a much larger issue, right? He's saying, by the way, this small issue, this relatively small issue of God knowing a world that changes and things like that, the limitation of the world doesn't affect God. The glaring, huge question that he has not yet explained is how does God know? What does it mean that how does God know then? Right? You're not, the Rambam would say, here's what the Rambam would probably say, it's very presumptuous of me, but theoretically, perhaps the Rambam would say like this. The Rambam would say that, I don't understand. How does God know his knowledge then? Right? You're not solving anything, Maharal. You're just pretending that everything's at a lower level, and you're moving us one step back, right? In other words, okay, his knowledge is separate from him, and so everything that he knows doesn't affect him. So how does he know his knowledge then, right? His knowledge is separate from him, right? The Rambam's solution is beautiful. The Rambam's solution is beautiful and very elegant in the sense that because his knowledge is not separate from him, you can't ask that question. There's no, how does he know his knowledge? He is his knowledge, and his knowledge is him, and it's all one, right? Once you come with the Maharal's answer, it's like a non-answer, right? He knows, and his knowledge is outside of him. So how does he? If it's outside of him, so how does he interact with his knowledge then? Right? It's the same. You just move the question one step further. Right?
Much more sense. I mean,
that's definitely a valid perspective. Absolutely.
I mean, it seems to.
Sure.
Yet we also know, but we know
there's a reason why the Rambam's answer is
it's not affected in any way.
But if the knowledge changes, and God doesn't change, how do you explain that?
And then there's the question of mitzvahs.
There's plenty in the Rambam's perspective that he himself would admit is completely inexplicable, right?
How does How do you explain this?
I'm glad that you're asking the question, because that's the exact point, right? The point is, that's what the Tzemach Tzedek is trying to build up. That's exactly what the Tzemach Tzedek is trying to build up. He's trying to say that the Maharal is so pious and so religious, and he says, you say that God is even a form of knowledge. That's out of the yeshiva, right? God is completely unknowable. It's completely abstract. The Tzemach Tzedek saying, we have other problems now, right? This is not as simple as it first appears. That's exactly the point. Those are the right questions. That's where we're going.
What took you so long?
So we managed to do like 4 lines of the Maimer tonight. Okay. Right? His essence, no problem arises from the fact that his knowledge changes, because why would his knowledge change? Why would his essence change if his knowledge is not his essence, right? In other words, the solution to a changing world and a limited world, and God knowing it, is simply that his knowledge is outside of him, right? He is simply described as all-knowing, and this is the path of life for that it is appropriate that every Jew should know and believe. In other words, the Maharal is saying, I am behind my position 100%. This is how Jews should think about God. Jews should think that God is completely removed from the world and his knowledge is separate from him. That's what the Maharal says. Ad kan l'shonei. Until here are the words of the Maharal. Right? V'kein, we have a couple more minutes. V'kein hevi talmidei ha-tosfos Yom Tov mishmoi. And so too, the Tosfos Yom Tov, who was a famous, I think his name was Yom Tov Lipman, if I'm not mistaken. He was a student of the Maharal. He was very famous. If you open up any Mishnah, which I don't know if we have one at hand here, otherwise I will show you. Yeah,
We have a little one.
the regular one, like just the old school. Yeah, that's Mishnah?
It's Mishnah.
Huh, go figure. So if you open up any Mishnah, right, the Mishnah is the basis for the Talmud. This is the basic work of the oral law, written by Rav Yehuda HaNasi back in the day. So if you open up any Mishnah, any regular Mishnah, it looks like this. You have in the middle, you have the Mishnah itself. That's in the middle. On one side, you have the Pirush of the Bartanura, the very famous Rav Vadjo Bartanura, who has more recently been immortalized in a fruity wine. So he wrote a commentary, sort of like Rashi's commentary on the Mishnah, the Bartanura. And you have the Tosfos Yom Tov, or the Ikar Tosfos Yom Tov, like selections from the Tosfos Yom Tov on the other side, which is a more sort of in-depth commentary on the Mishnayos. And this Tosfos Yom Tov was if I'm not mistaken, was the student of the Maharal. And so he writes in his teacher's name. The Tosfos Yom Tov writes as follows. Perek Hey Avos Mishnah Vav. In his commentary on the 5th chapter of Avos Mishnah Vav. Is anyone else curious what that is? I'm curious what that is. Let's see.
You don't know it by heart, you mean?
No, not yet. I only know by heart up to chapter 4. This is chapter 5. Let's see here. After Mincha. Sorry?
170 something.
Perek Hey now
270 something.
Chapter 5 Mishnah Vav. Chapter 5 Mishnah Vav of Pirkei Avos is about. That's an interesting one.
No?
The 10 things that were created on Erev Shabbos at twilight, right? Things that were created at the very end of the 6 days of creation. There's a list of 10 things that were created, right? The mouth of Bilam's donkey, Moses' staff, right? Some say the tongs, very famously, the Rebbe has a whole sikh about that, because how can you create tongs without other tongs first, right? So that's how do you create tong, like for a forge, yeah, like you hold something that you're forging in the fire or whatever it is, or in the water. How do you pick up? So the question is without metal tongs, how do you do that the first time? So some say in the Mishnah that the first pair of tongs was created by God, which is very interesting thing for the Mishnah to say here. Along with like miraculous things like the mouth of Bilam's donkey and the staff of Moses, you have the first pair of tongs, because otherwise there couldn't be any tongue. The Rebbe has a sikh about that. It's very interesting Mishnah. So on that Mishnah, the Tosfos Yom Tov says as follows. I'm at the bottom of page 87. We're over time. We're going to we'll see if we find a good place to stop. He says, "V'Rabbeinu b'derech Chaim, my teacher our master in Derech Chaim, in the book Derech Chaim, Hifli Eitzah gave wondrous counsel, Higdil Seishia, which increased salvation, Lahasir Zu Shaila, to remove this question. Which means to say that the question of how is it that God's will can change, doesn't that involve a change in God himself? If God, so to speak, desires something new, right, or desires something different than he did before, is not that a change in God? Right, and so Yom Tov is saying that God answers that the Maharal gives a wondrous answer to this question. And the answer is Amar ki the knowledge and the ability, everything that God does is separate, is among His actions, is separate from Him. Right, Mashakasav v'yada elikim, as it's written, and God knew. Right, there's that noun verb form again. Right, hu lashon pu'ula, which is it's in the verb form. It's something that God does, not something that God is. Right. And just as his other actions do not necessitate a change in him, which is, we're going to do that footnote, and that's going to be the last thing we do. And they do not cause a multiplicity in God, right? It's not like there's God's knowledge now and God's knowledge 5 minutes from now, and that means there's multiplicity, and that's a contradiction to simplicity, right? Rather, kach gam elu, so too his knowledge and his will and his ability and all of these things are separate from him and do not cause any change in him whatsoever. V'nismach b'zeh b'chachmas HaKabbalah ayin sham. And he depends on this, on the wisdom of the Kabbalah. He's saying when the Maharal says this, he's saying it based on the Kabbalah. See there. Ad kan l'shener, right? Ad kan l'shener. That's what the Tosfos Yom Tov says. Okay, so Tosfos Yom Tov basically seems to be more or less saying in different words what we said already. He's repeating the idea that these things are separate from God and they're only actions of God, right? God's knowledge and God's will and all these things.
Explains how he interacts.
No, not yet. No.
It does later?
No, I don't know if the Tosfos Yom Tov does. We have not yet. No, the Tosfos Yom Tov doesn't seem to say that. Let's do footnote 7. Because the Tosfos Yom Tov said, footnote 7, we'll end with footnote 7. The Tosfos Yom Tov said, right, that just as the other actions of God do not affect him, because they're separate from him, so too his knowledge and his abilities and his powers don't affect him either. They're also separate from him. So I guess the footnote is going to be on this question. What do you mean the other actions of God don't affect him? Footnote 7. In a larger sense, performing an activity does not involve a change in the person who performed it. As soon as he ceases the activity, he returns to his previous state. All that was necessary is that for a given amount of time he had to invest himself in the activity. His character, who he is as a person, is fundamentally unaffected by the performance of the activity. Moreover, in an ultimate sense, this is not an appropriate analogy. For while performing the activity, and even before, for preparation is necessary, a human being is involved, and afterwards the activity performed does bring about a change within him. Nevertheless, this is because man is acting in a world that exists outside of himself. Every interaction with that external environment involves change. By contrast, nothing exists outside of God. Hence, the activities he performs, his knowledge, his creation, his maintaining existence, do not cause him to change. It's an interesting footnote. Nothing exists outside of him, and therefore they do not cause him to change. That's interesting.
I think the secret of change is time. So if you invest time in something...
Time and space.
But that's
okay.
It's not part of...
That's not part of God. I mean, God is eternal and there's no...
It's not humanly possible to...
Right. To not change when you're immersed in something.
Right. It's like, what's the example? God can put himself through a needle with an elephant.
Right. Right.
But that's not something we comprehend. How that can be.
Yeah.
Beyond nature is something we don't comprehend.
No, the time. I will do yesterday. I mean, doesn't make sense.
But that I understand.
That's because of me.
No, because I do the same thing. That I understand.
Well, here's a question.
That's a bad example.
Came out, I was thinking about it. Something you said. When we are we born with knowledge that's dormant? And
yes.
When something happens,
I understand it to be yes. Yes.
It activates, or do we just learn it?
No, we have to learn it new. All new.
We're getting slapped in the face that we forget everything.
Yeah, that's what this is. That little thing.
Right.
Yeah. You knew it all. you knew the whole program.
We still know.
No, you lose it, it's all wiped out.
Yeah,
Like in my
we come with the knowledge and everyone gets
blank
Alzheimer.
What?
We come with all the knowledge and then in the split of a second we get Alzheimer.
When you're born, that's why you cry.
Smack you.
And that's why you have free choice. To learn it all again. Yeah, you do have part of it that's deep inside that has to sometimes just, it's there, but you have to learn it.
According to some people, you don't really have free choice.
Yeah.
Who is? Was he saying something this morning about?
Who? The rabbi? You do have free choice. You choose between doing what is
Well, is it or is it just that you think you have free choice?
No, you either have it or you don't have it. You can choose to do something right or choose to do something wrong.
It's the same thing like belief. Did it turn left or right?
Yeah, so what makes you say you don't have a choice?
But there it said, God made it turn left or right. That wasn't a choice.
What do you mean? I don't understand.
He said really on one of the examples.
I wasn't understanding. Can you read his
I had
little...
to finish the
Well, he's already blown through Dalit. He's already
Some interesting stuff
he
coming
won't
up.
share it.
Give it the
He's just
paper.
going to turn off the...
It's only going to be harder for the teacher going forward. Let's just put it that way.